Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung hosted Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi in his hometown of Andong today, as Korea and Japan sought to push ties beyond historical tensions and towards broader strategic cooperation. During their fourth face-to-face meeting, the two leaders agreed to deepen coordination on energy, supply chains, advanced technologies, and regional security, while also reaffirming closer bilateral and Korea-U.S. Japan cooperation amid growing uncertainty surrounding North Korea and the broader Indo-Pacific. The summit also carried heavy symbolic weight, combining formal diplomacy with traditional Andong culture and ceremony. So how significant was today's meeting, and could it mark a real turning point in Korea-Japan relations? For a deeper analysis on this, we connect to Choi Hyun-jin, Professor of Political Science at Kyunghee University. A big welcome, Professor.
Good evening. Glad to be here.
And also joining us is Matthew David Jenkins, Associate Professor of Political Science at Gyeongsang National University. Good to see you, Professor.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Jenkins. So after, we've seen the summit go on today, I wonder, how did you assess today's summit overall between the two leaders, and what stood out to you the most?
Yeah, so I would say it was very successful. It was, it's the main thing that stands out to me is the fact that it happened at all, right? That these summits are happening at all, and the deepness, right? The depth of the cultural exchange. On the one hand, it's very symbolic, right? Exchanging cultures, exchanging liquors, right? Foods, and these kinds of things. On the other hand, if you think about the context of the relationship between Korea and Japan, this doesn't happen every day, right? The last time we saw this kind of exchange, this level of exchange, was probably, it's almost 30 years ago in the Kim Dae-jung administration with Prime Minister Oguchi, right? And so, and before that, Hosokawa, Prime Minister Hosokawa, came to visit Korea and apologized about, the past atrocities and things like that. And the focus wasn't really about strategic cooperation. It was just about, like, can we exist as two countries next to each other and not, like, be so angry about the past or be so angry about the political stances, right? And it's just it's pretty incredible, honestly. In not just this summit, but to see the summit last time where they're drumming in Nara, right? That was pretty amazing. And I think just the fact that they have kept it going is amazing, and really interesting to see if they continue to keep it going.
Right. Like you said, the fact that it happened in just a couple months since their last encounter is in fact a very big development. And also, one of the most striking aspects of today's summit was also the setting itself, with the meeting taking place in Andong, President Lee's hometown, and a symbolic center of Korea's traditional culture. Professor Choi, how meaningful was the choice of this venue?
Yeah, I think the choice of Andong as a venue was very symbolic and important. As you just mentioned, Andong is known as one of the cultural and the historical centers of Korea, and this city represents some traditional Korean culture and also Confucian value. So by inviting the Prime Minister Takaichi to his hometown, the President Lee was sending a message that this relationship between the two countries is becoming more personal based on mutual trust. And at the same time, I think Seoul also wanted to show that the Korea-Japan relationship is no longer limited to formal meeting in capital city. And therefore, the holding the summit in this Andong city created a warmer and more human atmosphere. And there's also an important political message as well. The President Lee has sometimes been seen in Japan as more critical of Japan than previous conservative Korean leaders. However, by hosting the summit in such a symbolic place in Korea and giving what officials called near state guest level treatment to Prime Minister Takaichi, the President Lee was showing that the South Korean government wants pragmatic and also stable relationship with Japan in spite of historical issues. So I think in many ways, the location itself became part of the diplomacy.
Definitely, definitely. And also this meeting, it marked the sixth Korea-Japan summit since the launch of the Lee Jae Myung administration, and what we call the so-called shuttle diplomacy, it's appearing much more firmly restored. Professor Che, how significant is that itself for the stability and direction of bilateral ties?
Yes, I think the restoration of so-called shuttle diplomacy between Korea and Japan is very important because regular communication help prevent tensions from growing into bigger problem. And in the past, Korea and Japan often had some political and diplomatic disputes because of historical issues, and this kind of problem often stopped the high-level talk between the two countries. However, when leaders meet regularly and also maintain this direct communication channel, it becomes much easier to manage disagreements before they become more serious. And what is especially interesting is also the speed and frequency of the summit meeting. And this was already the sixth summit meeting under the Lee Jae Myung administration. And both leaders even visited each other's hometown within just a few months. And this is quite unusual in diplomacy. So how was this possible? So I think the current global situation, which is very unstable, right? And this situation is pushing Seoul and Tokyo closer together. So both Korea and Japan are facing, for example, pressure from the Trump administration, including some demand related to the Hormuz Strait peace operation, and also there are tariff issues, right? So in that kind of uncertain environment, I think both leaders seem to feel a stronger need for close cooperation and communication. So I think this frequent shuttle diplomacy is not just symbolic, it's a very practical tool for maintaining Korea-Japan relationship in this difficult international environment.
So as Professor Chaz mentioned, we are living in this era of uncertainty, of course, a lot of uncertainty we're seeing around the world. And despite historical tensions that still remain between the two countries, the latest summit appeared to place much greater emphasis on future-oriented cooperation and practical coordination as well. Professor Jenkins, do you think Seoul and Tokyo are now entering a more stable phase in terms of relationship?
Yeah, so, I want to be cautious because we've seen this happen from time to time, relations becoming a bit warmer. As I mentioned, in the early 90s, a similar thawing in relations happened. And in the later 90s also, again, we had a bit of a thaw. And then in 2011 is kind of when the recent in trouble in the relationship began or rose to the surface again. And so I think, though, the thing that makes me a little more confident that it's going to keep going is that the strategic situation, like the interests, right? The strategic interests are totally different from 2011. If you think about everything that happened between 2011 and now, you got the coronavirus, you have the Ukraine-Russia war, you have the rise of China as a legitimate challenger to U.S. hegemonic power. You have the COVID virus, right? This disruption in supply chains. Now, all these things happen. It's just a totally different world we live in, and the strategic interests that Japan and Korea face are just vastly different. And I think this, in terms of if you want to bet on what's going to happen, you look at what the strategic interests are, and there's a massive incentive to cooperate right now, economically, militarily, diplomatically between South Korea and Japan, and I think those are very strong, and I think it's going to drive cooperation into the near future. You never know, because public opinion can change, the strategic situation can change, but right now, especially given the sort of the vacillation of the United States in terms of its willingness to support its two partners, I think those are some pretty strong incentives to keep cooperating.
Now, if we delve deeper into the concrete agendas during the summit, the two leaders also agreed to strengthen cooperation in LNG and crude oil amid growing instability, of course, in global energy markets due to the Middle East situation. Professor Che, how effective do you think this kind of Korea-Japan coordination could actually be in responding to future supply chain shocks?
Yes, so it's true that both countries are now sharing some concerns about global economic situation. But I think these kind of concerns are now pushing both countries much closer together. So the region instability in the Middle East after the invasion of Iran by the United States has created growing concern about energy supply, oil price, and global supply chain. And since both countries, Korea and Japan, are highly dependent on external oil and gas, so we are both very sensitive and vulnerable to global energy shock. And that's why the two leaders focus so much on LNG cooperation, oil supply coordination, and supply chain partnership during this summit. So I think this kind of a coordination can be quite effective, especially during a sudden crisis. And of course, both Korea and Japan cannot control global energy price, or we cannot control major geopolitical conflict between, for example, China and the United States. But however, the close cooperation between the two countries can help reduce risk and improve crisis management. For example, sharing information on the LNG supply and oil reserve and the conditions of a sea lane, and this kind of information can help those countries react more quickly during emergency and also prevent unnecessary panic in the energy market. So in that sense, I think today's summit showed that Korea and Japan increasingly see each other not only as neighbors, but also as a key partner for energy security.
So combined efforts between the two would definitely be helpful moving forward. Now, the two sides have also reaffirmed closer Korea-Japan and Korea-U.S. Japan security coordination while also discussing peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Excuse me. Professor Jenkins, in your view, how important is Korea-Japan cooperation becoming in responding to the North Korean issue and the broader security environment?
Yeah, it's central. I mean, it's greatly important, right? The two countries have very complementary capabilities. Korea is in a sort of a forward position with massive intelligence gathering capabilities and forward capabilities, whereas Japan sits more of in a rear support position, has a number of naval bases, naval capacity, and it is in a great position to provide backup support, right, and to support any kind of military operations in Korea. And so it's massively important. And it's not just North Korea, right? North Korea is just one issue in a complex of issues like that affect the broader Indo-Pacific. Right, you have the rise of China, you have the rise of the Southeast Asian powers. And so I think that and the expansion of China into the South China Sea, for example, and so these things are not something that they can do alone, right? They're not going to be able to handle it alone. Taiwan, right, is another one. These are things that are going to require a cooperation, and people have the tendency to sort of approach Korea as if it were still back in the 1990s or something. Korea is a middle power. Like Korea is a strong country, and it's however it faces this growing potential security dilemma, right? In terms of these issues I just spoke about, and so it's going to require cooperation. It's going to require an alliance, right, of sorts, in order to meet the challenge. And I think that that alliance, that partnership, well, maybe not use the word alliance exactly. If it goes to that degree, awesome. But certainly at least partnership and coordination is going to be essential to combating North Korea, especially in the context of like changing capabilities in terms of AI, North Korea's expanding nuclear capabilities and these sorts of things. And that's just not something you be able to do alone.
Right. And now that you've just pointed out, the two countries also emphasized cooperation in advanced industries like AI and space and biotechnology as well. How far could this industrial and economic impact of this cooperation realistically expand going forward?
Yeah, so I think there's a certain there's high potential for it to expand. You know, there again, they have military complementarities. They also have economic complementarities. For example, South Korea manufactures semiconductors, right? South Korea is one of the world's largest manufacturers of semiconductors. In order to make the semiconductors, South Korea requires a chemical called photoresists, and those are made by Japan, right? And so there are a number of these complementarities that, you know, in the past, we've just sort of looked at those as, okay, those are just separate parallel industries growing up. One happens to you know, feed into the other. And I think now what they're realizing is that these complementarities need to be strengthened and coordinated, right? And they need to be a little bit better managed, right? And so I think there's enormous potential there. On the AI front, you know, the real leaders in AI are, of course, United States and China. So I think for the Korea-Japan partnership, it would be more about expanding the, you know, sort of hardware basis that is able to adapt to AI as it continues to evolve and to handle AI capabilities. I guess the thing that would be most complementary would be AI in the medical field, right? Both countries face an aging population, and both countries are sort of rushing to develop AI technologies in the medical field. And so I think that's probably an area where they could certainly, we would expect to see greater cooperation and information sharing and as we go on to the future.
So it's definitely something to look forward to moving forward. Now, on historical issues, the two governments have also announced the start of DNA identification procedures related to remains recovered from Japan's Jose coal mine. Professor Che, what significance does this carry in terms of addressing historical issues between the two countries? And do you think it could lead to more meaningful progress?
I think this is a small but meaningful step in dealing with the historical issues between Korea and Japan. The DNA identification process is basically an effort to identify the remains of Korean forced labor victims who died at Japan's Josei coal mine during the colonial era and return them to their family. And of course, you know, historical issues are very sensitive and difficult to solve completely. But the important point is that the two governments are still trying to cooperate on humanitarian issues. And I think both leaders are trying to handle history in a more calm and future-oriented way. So instead of turning every historical issue into diplomatic trouble, they are starting with the areas where practical cooperation is still possible. So I don't think this alone will solve all historical issues between the two countries, but I think these efforts, the identification of DNA, it can still become a meaningful starting point toward building a more trust and a more stable and durable relationship between the two countries.
Right. So given the background between the two, even limited progress can still carry a lot of meaning moving forward. Now, beyond this formal talks, the two leaders are also expected to continue their exchange through a traditional Andong-style dinner and cultural events, including the Seonyu Julbulnori fireworks performance. Professor Che, how important can these kinds of cultural and emotional gestures be in strengthening bilateral trust?
I think these kind of cultural gestures and cultural ceremonies are actually quite important, especially between Korea and Japan, where history and emotion still matters a lot. So formal meetings and formal agreements are important, of course, but diplomacy is also about building trust and personal relationship between leaders. So sharing food and the local food and culture and the traditional events, and they can help create a warmer and a more relaxed atmosphere. And I also think that this kind of a gesture can send a positive message to people in both countries because they show that the relationship in the two countries is not only about politics and security, they are also about the mutual respect and human connection. So while this kind of cultural event may look like symbolic, but I think they can still help create a better and a long-term relationship between the two countries.
Let's hope for that to make a lot of more progress moving forward. Now, finally, before just the symbolism and ceremony that we've seen today, Professor Jenkins, what do you think will ultimately determine whether this summit becomes a genuine turning point in Korea-Japan relations?
Right. So I think, turning point is a lot to expect. The main thing is keep it going, right? If they keep it going and they keep these regularized talks up, regularized summits up, that's gonna be very important in making this a real change in South Korea-Japan relations. I think the best thing is to institutionalize them, right? Have annual summits, give it a name, right? Something like this that creates, and it's not just a one-off, right? It's not just a one-time show. It's a regularized annual or biannual sort of summit. And I think to institutionalize it like that and formalize it would be a great step. And to expand just beyond politics, is job training exchanges, for example, lower level ministerial meetings, like education exchanges. I think a broader platform of cooperation is going to help make this difficult to just abandon, right? What you want to do from South Korea's perspective and Japan's perspective is to make sure that this is something that it would be politically difficult to just give up, right? You have this great thing going, this great partnership, and then you just walked away because of some political reason, right? Because that's what happens, right? A Japanese politician will go and visit the Asakuni Shrine, and then that will destroy the entire talks, right? Even it has to be something, it has to be made, strengthened so that it won't, the relationship won't just collapse because of some event like that, or because of a protest in Korea, or because of a court ruling in Korea, right? There has to be some political capital invested in this that makes it something that's genuine and worthy of continuing to pursue.
Right, a very important point, and we'll be looking forward to see whether today's momentum would continue in the coming years to come. But as for now, we'll have to end our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Jenkins.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And Professor Che, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.